Hello, I'm Sarah Gander, and this is your Faculty Development Podcast for Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick. Joining me today is Rachel Ouellette, a pediatrician from Fredericton. Today we're going to talk about generational differences and teaching millennials, the challenges and the joys, and dare I say, the debate about post-call and teaching this new generation. So today I'd like to welcome Dr. Rachel Ouellette, who's a good friend of mine and colleague, a pediatrician in Fredericton, New Brunswick since 2011. She went to Memorial University and then to Queen's for residency. And a lady after my own heart came after me as we trained together, and also married a golf professional, also has two young, beautiful boys at home, and as a pediatrician has had many of an encounter with learners on the inpatient unit and also as outpatient clinics and whatnot. And so welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So today, our topic for this podcast is really related to a topic that I think is near and dear to people's hearts who are engaged with learners quite often, and that is the millennial learner. Mm-hmm. And we really feel that we tend to hear a lot of comments like, the students today are so entitled, or they just don't work hard enough, or, you know, they're lazy or whatever, or the perpetual eye roll around post-call and whatnot. So I thought it would be fun for you and I to sit down, you know, being the young pups that we are ourselves, and ask ourselves, you know, are they so different than us, or what are we experiencing, or how can we flip this for the positive? What do you think?
Exactly. And I think with these generational things, I even feel uncomfortable thinking that now I'm old, as you mentioned. But you're right. There is a younger generation. They are different from our own generation and the generations ahead of us. But I think there's something to be learned from them, or maybe they can teach us something in how we educate them, because they've learned different things and they're technologically savvy. And so I will often ask them questions that I've learned from. So I think we need to correct those negative comments that are out there, or at least learn to live with them and move from there.
So when we talk about millennials, and you look up the definition of millennial, so also known as Generation Y, these are students who are born in sort of the early to mid 1980s into the early 2000s. And the other definitions for them are like the terms would be like the net generation, or the Peter Pan or trophy generation. And they're largely shaped by some of the social and political influences of that time. So 9/11, mm-hmm. the internet, so really powerful external influences that, you know, are really fascinating to me. How do you think that kind of thing influences a generation? Like you and I went to school without the internet.
Exactly. And we learned a different way, right? We went to the library. We did not dial up on the internet to search for this information.
Do they still have dial up?
I don't think so. But I still recall that sound. A sound that these students will never know.
Thank God it's not a ringtone.
But yeah, how they were raised, I think, will make a difference in how they are educated, even as adult learners, right? Because I think they were parented differently than we were perhaps parented. I recall being outside for hours and no parents or adults around, but there was a parent, the community parented you in a way, right?
Yeah, or like the screen time that you had was whatever a cartoon was playing on Saturday morning, and if you didn't like it, then, well, I guess you're not watching TV.
Exactly. And so, and some of the supposed millennial generation had helicopter parents, right? And their parents were their best friends. Right? They weren't necessarily the disciplinarian. They wanted to be the best friend. And so I think when they think of their parent as that, when they move on to other authoritative, I'm saying the wrong word.
Authoritative?
Yeah.
Authoritative? Yeah.
Other authority figures.
Very good.
They, as educators to them, they want to be our best friends.
I know, like they want your cell phone number, they want your email. And then when they email you, it's 11 o'clock at night. And then they're shocked when you haven't responded to them, like even by the next day.
Exactly. Or
like,
a Facebook friend.
Yeah,
I want to be your Facebook friend.
Yeah. Like the social media, just like interface with learners is a really interesting concept in and of itself.
I think that's a podcast in itself.
Yeah.
And how to manage that.
Well, there's a really nice study that looks at the perception of students with their presence on social media. So when they combine the very much or very likely, over 50% of students do not feel that their social media presence has any influence on their professional profile, not social media profile, but just like public profile. So they see it as different. I do not see it as different. Like, I don't know about you, but like if I'm going to hire somebody, what's the first thing you do? Like you Google them and see what their social media profile is like. Maybe right after looking at their CV, but maybe not.
It's a reference in itself. Right?
So I think, there you go. There's like a beautiful opportunity for us to give something back to our learners who may feel like we don't have as much to give to them, but, is guiding them through these ethical landscapes of what it means to be a professional. Like a lot of millennial students coming into medical school is their first job, like ever.
That's right.
And you got to show up, right? But when somebody's always made excuses for you or like driven you to the door so you don't be late, or if you're late, you're only a minute late because maybe that's the helicopter parent thing, then, all of a sudden these students are also having to navigate their first job and what those expectations are.
Exactly. And the other big point in learner from the millennial generation is that my understanding is that they actually thrive on a good work-life balance, right? And so I think that's where that comes from, perhaps, is that, their time management is, they have different priorities than we do. And we shun them for that immediately. They get punished or they get, spoken to because they're late or they want to go home at a certain hour.
Yeah, or they've got 100 other things on the go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But is that something we should be faulting them for, or should we be learning from them?
Well, but you and I have both sat on admission type committees and whatnot, and like look at the people who get admitted to medical school now or offered a position in medical school and then residency. Their CVs are padded with like, they're building schools in Haiti and they're like, I don't even know what else, like all the things. And then as soon as they get into medical school, we are like, what do you mean you have to be somewhere at 5 o'clock? Like work's not done, and give them a hard time. And you just sort of think like you can't have it both ways.
Yeah. That's why we wanted you in med school. And now that's why we don't want you to attend those things because you are now in med school.
But the school in Haiti's not finished.
Yes.
So it's true. But you're right. We can learn from them too, because, it was just the Canadian Medical Association Journal this month that talked about the rising rates of physician suicide in terms of being able to have that mental wellness. And every conference in town now has sessions on burnout and wellness. And so did we get it right? Like, do we have it right? Or do the learners that are coming after us, have they figured out a solution to that? And then maybe they have some ideas where we can learn from them.
Exactly. Yeah, I hope there is.
So I'm sure you've heard of the concept of the adult learner. And I've always rejected that concept because, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, because we're pediatricians, so we're very engaged with the idea of a developmental spectrum. And I consider myself an adult learner and a lifelong learner, but I think that our students are in this sort of peri-learning time. Like, what do you think about the concept of the adolescent learner?
The adolescent learner or the adult learner?
Well, if you and I are adult learners, because we're done our like formal training, but our learners are still in their training. And so could we conceptualize them as not yet being full grown, but being in this sort of pubescent time of learning? And so they still need to learn how to learn.
Exactly. Okay. So we as adult learners that have developed this concept of how we want to continue lifelong learning. How are we going to pass that along to this prepubescent brain that is still developing? And we are
some of the learners are like older than us, so I guess that's kind of funny. But you know, I guess I just mean, what do we have to offer them when, with the internet and devices, information and being able to just spit out a list of differential diagnosis or a bunch of like, what's the most common bug for pneumonia? Like, they can Google that in a second. Exactly. And should we be stopping them from doing that, right? Because that's just their new reality. How can we shape their learning and approach to be more sophisticated than that, but also is something that they need to learn how to navigate? Like, maybe what we have to offer is, gone are the days where we ask people to memorize things because you can Google it.
Right.
Maybe it's time for us to build curriculum around how do you Google something and then decide what the best thing is to click on.
Yeah, and I think they're better at that than we are, actually, because they've lived this, right? So they already know that a Google search is suboptimal because they've got, I don't even know the terminology. There's like Scholar Google now, right? So we're on the wrong side. We're using the wrong searcher. So I think they already know that. But I think the part that we as educators can help them is, you're right, we can't ask them to memorize things because what's the point? They can Google it or Google Scholar it. But they may not have had the experience in problem solving because of those helicopter parents that have solved all their problems, or have not even provided them with problems to solve because they have guided them so diligently. And so maybe that's the part, is that we need to give them problems for them to solve. And we have to step back and let them do it and let them make mistakes, because that's the other thing they're not really good at, is making mistakes and how to learn from those mistakes.
Right. And so it just reminds me too of like the problem-based learning that they only started to adopt in the curriculum when you and I were going through training, and that, we've moved away from those didactic lectures and into more of that problem-solving avenue, which I think is probably largely in response to the changing way that people are learning and the way information is kind of consumed in the curriculum. But it just got me to thinking, as we were talking about that topic of devices in day-to-day use. So I have, in my lifetime as a supervising physician, been entirely irritated by the cell phone in the hand during an encounter with a patient in their room. And I can only imagine then the lens of the patient when they feel that somebody's stuck in their phone. And what I've said to students in the past is like, the patient does not know if you are looking something up or if you are texting your girlfriend. Like, it's the perception more so than your actual intent. But at the same time, here we are with technology just like all over the place. And frankly, you and I use it often in our day-to-day work. So how do you feel like we can guide learners in terms of their device usage?
Yeah, and to their defense, they are excellent multitaskers because they've been doing this a long time, a longer time than we have, when you think of their percentage of life. But and it's no longer in their palm, right? It's now in the watch. And it looks like they're looking at the time, which is also rude. But they're getting information even from that. So I think technology is always advancing and trying to figure out how to optimize our work-life balance, but also being present and being a role model in that for the students, right? I will often catch myself answering pages or texts or whatnot when I'm trying to have a teaching moment with a student, and I have to catch myself to stop because my priority in that moment should be teaching that student that pearl, right? And that even switchboard can wait 2 minutes for me to complete my sentence.
Yeah, I think we're all at a time in society where everything is so immediate, and it is disruptive. And, I used to say we never used to walk into a patient room with an enormous textbook and start flipping through the pages in front of a patient, or at least didn't do that very often. And so do you really need to look up that thing right then and there? But we're so used to that immediate gratification. And then at what cost, right? Like if the patient thinks that you're not actually listening because your face is in your device. So maybe guiding them on that kind of ethical frontier would be helpful.
Yeah. For many of these topics, I think one thing that we need, a take-home point for faculty, is that these learners need a very good orientation, right? And so that point, that technology point, the timeliness point, the expectations of what learning you're going to do after hours needs to be written down or sat down and verbatim. And it's things that you or I may not think we need to orient people on, but the proper dress attire is included in that.
Oh my
so
gosh.
It's not
Have you
so
ever
much
sent
common
anybody
sense.
Home? Have you ever sent anybody home?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
what were they wearing?
I could see clearly what underwear was coming out of their...
That's been my experience too. There was a whole phase of time when lacy t-shirts or shirts were like the thing. And, it was a conversation and, about if I can see with a pattern on your bra or underwear, then I would put that in the category of not work appropriate.
That is inappropriate. Exactly. So I think we have to accept that technology is here and it's coming and it's helpful, but at what point do we need to be in the moment with our patients? I don't think I want technology not to be part of that, right? Because that one-on-one conversation, the person part is not on the phone, is not on your watch. You need to hear it full on.
No, it's so hard though, because like EMR and we're rewarding people for efficiency and so it is so much easier to think about doing your note at the same time as the interface. But I can tell you as an EMR kind of half user, I can't do it.
I can't either.
I can't.
But our learners are capable of doing it.
And you've seen them do it in your office?
Yes.
Where they can kind of do it at the same time?
So I've taken the computer out of my office because I myself didn't like using it, but my students are wondering why they can't do that. But I know that they can, and I've seen it in other situations, more family-based practice, perhaps that's quicker visits, I guess. But no, I have taken the computer out of the examining room for that reason. I couldn't do it, so I don't want them to do it, I guess. Paternalistic here.
Yeah. If I can't have it, you can't have it either. But I can see it. I'd be really interested to know if what some of the studies, I assume they've done these, are the patient's perspective of, whether or not their doctor pays more or less attention to them if they have an EMR computer in the room, or sort of that patient lens of technology in the office. Right. I can only assume that some of that work has been done, but because of course that's really what matters,
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder at what point will students come out and be like, I don't know what to do with this paper chart. What do you want me to do?
What is this?
You mean I need to turn a page to find the last consult? Where in this large chart is the cardiology consult from 1975?
Oh my God, right. But you kind of feel like there's some sort of sick gratification of being like, I want you to go down to health records and find out what the cardiologist said in 1972 when they had their valve replacement, and that's like a fate worse than death, that you've like sent the student down to the archives.
Yep. They're going to call their parent. They're going to cry.
Oh, gosh. Well, it's just, you hear the stories about the people who fail or like don't get the job or whatever, and then like the parents show up.
Oh, yes.
That hasn't happened to me yet, where like a parent has been involved. But, and like my mom was really good to me, so I guess I shouldn't say that I wasn't coddled in a lot of ways. But it's well described that the parents of that generation, we're very... like you say, the helicopter, that's where that definition kind of came from, was that generation. And so it speaks to exactly what you said, that orientation, the setting of expectations has to be very, very clear. Because, even today we had a message from one of the learners who had calculated the amount of call that they had, compared it to the call of her colleagues, and it just so happened that one of the ward clerks at the hospital said, geez, I've seen you 3 weekends in a row at the hospital. That seems like more call than your colleagues. So like, not helpful, right? Because this person now has planted this seed that this person has more call than the other person. And so, what does she do? Emails our call schedule assistant and politely outlines the injustice of it all, and then kind of says, so what are you going to do about it? And you just kind of think, oh, wow.
It seems entitled, but they thrive on fairness and justice, right?
Totally.
And so that is a perfect example of the generation, right? And I think if we had clearly, and I'm sure you did an excellent orientation, but I think if it was clearly stated in, 1 and 4, and we're not exceeding that amount, and you don't know the characteristics of the other learners and what the circumstances are for them, for you right now, this is what I expect, and we are meeting our limits as expected.
Yeah, I think it's fairness and justice, but isn't it interesting that people just come into situations assuming that they're kind of getting screwed, like assuming that there's some sort of unfairness in it all, and like that they need to check and make sure. And I think the reason why millennials feel that way, or at least this is what the literature talks about, is that because of the internet and because of the kind of global nature of the world, their heroes are all on display, right? So you and I would have had blind sort of heroes in our time. Like we didn't really know anything else about them. I'm like blanking on who a hero would have been at the time. Because the example for millennials, and a good example for us because we live the golf world a little bit, is Tiger Woods, right? So like Tiger Woods is a whole lot of awesome and like probably the best golfer that ever was. And then we all know kind of how that ended when, his wife went after him with a golf club because he had been cheating on her and with all the people, it seemed, and all these sorts of things. And so he has this like very public, very detailed fall from grace. Now it's interesting because we're recording this podcast only a few weeks after the Masters when he makes a comeback and all is forgiven, which is another conversation. But anyway, we are heroes. We didn't know anything about them, right? Like the worst thing that happened was like Corey Feldman or Corey, what
one
did he die? One of the Corys commits suicide or something. And then like that's the end of it because there's no internet. So nobody knows anything else.
Exactly.
So you just kind of think of the people, we just could blindly trust people and not have to worry about the other drama. But now, and this is true of the authority figures that our students have to encounter, is that the trust isn't there right out of the gates. You have to earn it from them.
Exactly.
Which means you have to have clear expectations. You have to do what you say you're going to do. So I think for us, that has to be feedback and support and backup.
Right. And setting expectations and limitations on even that, I will be giving you feedback at this time, and this is called feedback. This is not just us having a chit chat about,
Right, because isn't that true? Like there's whole faculty development sessions, obviously, on giving feedback, but usually one of the take-home messages is, if you don't say to the student, I am now going to give you feedback, then they actually don't know that you're giving them feedback, which is shocking. These are not unintelligent people.
No.
But it's just that very overtness.
But they think that it's a friendly conversation, right?
Yeah.
Because you're their best friend now.
Yeah.
On Facebook.
I actually think that Facebook is for old people now. It's it's supposed to be like Instagram or Snapchat or something like that.
I am old then.
So what do you think then about this sort of concept of reward and trophy? And like you and I, we fill out 1,000 assessments and evaluations. So gone are the days that average is actually average. Our learners tend to get properly, I guess, what's a Newfoundland way to say it? Rotted if they don't get a very good, like an exceptional.
Exactly. Yeah. Again, they've never failed. And I think the population that we are educating as medical students, we're top of their class to get to where they are. And so they probably really have never failed. Right. And so they've always excelled. And now they come into a field that it's okay to make mistakes. That's how you learn. And you can't know it all. Right. And so when comes the time to give that, let's call it constructive feedback, they don't know how to handle that.
Yeah, like I've had a few criers.
They all cry.
And like crying, they've passed, and like they're average with always would I give some constructive criticism. But, it's like an APGAR score when a baby's born. Like I seldom give out 10s because nobody should be told that they're perfect.
Yes. Even a baby.
Even a newborn baby who arguably is pretty darn close. But, then there's nowhere to go but down. So I think that how can we change curriculum and guide students to be able to accept that actually being slightly lower than perfect is a really great place to be, akin to this kind of movement of failure as learning. Like, you're not succeeding unless you've failed many, many times.
Yeah, I don't know the answer, and I don't know all of the literature, but I have changed how I provide feedback now.
Okay.
Because before I would give this like global statement about you're excellent at building rapport, and it's always, and I try to find the right words that,
Is this the
lift them up.
SHIT sandwich?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
But what I do now is I go case-based, right? And so I will, at the end of the day, be like, okay, what were your 5 patients you saw today? Okay, let's talk about the headache one. What did you learn from that assessment? Right?
Ooh, this is good.
Yeah. What did you learn from that assessment? What did you forget to ask? What could you do differently at the next headache assessment, right? And they'll be like, oh, I forgot to ask about the headache in the night. I'm like, great. That's your pearl for this case, is that next time, do not forget to ask for headaches in the middle of the night, because that is a red flag. And so I'm identifying that they've missed something. But they're
it's not
learning.
your fault.
No,
Yeah.
but they're learning, right? And so I think, and I don't know how that kind of comes back, but so I go case-based now. I'm like, you must have learned something from each patient you've seen today. What did you learn? And sometimes it's not necessarily medicine. Sometimes it's social interactions or documentation or something, right? And so I feel like there's a learning pearl with each interaction, and that's what I'm focusing on now.
Which makes so much sense with, again, a movement towards real-time feedback being so much more valuable than this kind of formative or cumulative feedback that like somebody needs to gather and then deliver to them in sort of an inauthentic kind of venue where, because I did that for 10 years when I was pediatric clerkship director,
Right.
that you'd meet with people that like, frankly, I may not have even really worked with. And I'm going, well, everybody thinks you're really nice. And you do a good job, and the patients like you, and it's just very vague and nondescript kind of feedback.
And not overly constructive, right?
Right.
And so, and that came because now with LIC students, I'm evaluating after 6 months of seeing them on and off kind of thing.
Right.
And then I have to evaluate them again at 12 months, and I can't remember the headache case 12 months later, right? So now I write it down on their daily evaluation, and I save it for my mid and final evaluations, because then I have something constructive to write. And it's also a reminder 5 months later, remember, and it's not necessarily written down, but I'm having a conversation with them because we're besties. But I'm like, so remember, I'm going to write this down, but like, remember, what did we learn from that headache case? What's the red flag you need to know? And then hopefully 5 months later, they still remember that learning tip because I've written it down and I remember. But
so do you think in terms of bridging the generational difference, we're ready for them to give us feedback in real time?
I think we need to. And they're not afraid to give you feedback.
I know. That's kind of the secret joy of this generation, because they're really not scared.
No.
And so maybe we could leverage that, because one of the faculty complaints since the dawn of time, right, is that we don't get, like, we have to assess the students, but we don't get a lot of feedback ourselves. And when we do, it's this like pooled mash of feedback over ages that like really isn't that valuable to us either, because they need to anonymize the students. But is it time to be like, okay, students, like, step up, let's do this? And how do we kind of navigate the ethics around that so they don't feel like there's a consequence? Like, we have to do their assessment and then they can do ours, and we can't change theirs afterwards if they piss us off.
Yes. And I still do that. I submit and then I ask them, so this isn't going to change your assessment because it's submitted, but tell me, how can we change the rotation for the next student? Or what was good, what was bad? Tell me the good, the dirty, the ugly, like everything, right? So,
but what if they even gave us feedback about our direct like supervision performance? Like, what if they said to you, you know, Dr. Ouellette, like, I had a really nice time with you. You had really interesting patients, but I noticed that actually between patients, you didn't do a lot of sort of bedside teaching. You just went into your office to like maybe whatever their perception is, like play on your computer or talk on your phone, which like everybody listening and you and I would know exactly what you're probably doing.
Right.
You're doing your note or your calling your kids or like whatever it is. It's actually none of their business what you're doing. But wouldn't it be interesting to have them give us that feedback
in real time?
Not
at the end of the rotation.
But then they learn too that like, hey, actually, when you're a staff, if I don't finish my notes today, like I have a whole other clinic tomorrow that I just don't want to face that. Or like, hey, this is the hidden curriculum, right? Like, hey, I have to pick up my kids by 5. And I don't bring work home with me because that's my boundary or whatever. Maybe it would open up a whole actually new interface of how we could coach students.
I like that.
Yeah. All right. There you go. We're solving problems here. Amazing. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about, because I just can't resist. I've given talks on generational differences in millennials in the past, and you just can't avoid it. The post-call issue is a thing. And yes, it tends to be the surgeons who start the conversation, but it bleeds into the rest of us as well. Do you have any thoughts on, is post-call a dying thing? Is competency-based by design going to solve all of our problems in this world, or what do you think about that?
Well, I've already changed our approach. We don't have post calls because we don't make them do overnight call. And so that alone has changed, right? And there is some overnights that we do it on the weekends when there's no risk of losing out the next day. But we tried to figure out where is the most optimal learning, and the most optimal learning for us in our clinic is the office-based, consult-based practice. And so what we were finding is that there's no way of predicting your call, right? And more often than not, the students were sleeping better on call than they were at home. Mm-hmm. So we do home call, but very rarely have to call them after midnight. And that's something to be said about our community hospital, is that many times the staff may get a call, but can give advice verbally and see the patient 2 hours later during daytime hours.
Right, which contributes to your sustainability in this life.
Yeah. And so in those situations, if I had a medical student in-house, then maybe I would have woken them up at 4:00 in the morning to see that patient. But then they don't get to see the 12 other interesting cases that I've purposefully booked for them because I knew that I had a learner that day.
Oh, that is the worst. There is nothing because they change their schedules. And so there's nothing worse than thinking that you have a student double booking and then finding out that they had switched their call schedule. So now they're post call and so now they're not coming. Okay. So going back to expectations,
yes,
that is a very clear one in our world, which is if you're going to switch your call, there are people who may be expecting you. So
update.
Yeah.
Accountability.
So on the topic of post-call, I mean, we've said a couple of things about, your ideas around what works for pediatrics or a specialty that is largely outpatient, that maybe keeping students more in that environment makes a lot of sense to meet criteria. But I wonder what a more inpatient specialty could do, like surgery, internal medicine, places like that, where I think people would argue there's so much learning in the nighttime. And I know one of the ENT fellows who I was on service a couple weeks ago, and he was around quite a bit. I apologized for calling him on a day that I realized he would have been post-call. But when he answered, he's like, oh, like I'm a 4th-year ENT resident. Like I don't have time for post-call. Like I need to do as many operations and be there when I can. So I just feel bad because there's like this balance of course you need to see these things. Of course you want to see these things, but post-call's there to almost protect you from yourself.
That's true. Yeah, I think we baby our learners in pediatrics. It's definitely it's a known fact. And to be fair, when we are on call and there is an interesting case, that one-on-one teaching opportunity is great for the learner. And I think that's surgical, right? That intimate learning situation.
Like the apprenticeship.
Yeah. And you're in the OR, just you and your staff and another person.
Even I liked that in surgery.
Oh, I hate surgery. No offense, guys.
Surgery was the worst. But I remember saying to Hugh Scarth, I don't know for any of you out there who remember Hugh Scarth, saying to him, if I've seen it before, can I just go to the ward and look at EKGs and I promise they won't call you? And he kind of looked at me like, okay.
You liked the scut.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd be interested to have another surgical specialty bring that information in, because I don't know. I don't know how you balance it out, but I think in the surgical world, you're right. Like, that's how they learn. They want to get their hands dirty. That's where they want to do the learning. But it's interesting though, because that was our generation. That was our colleague residents and fellows doing that. But I wonder if that's happening now. And again, I'm not the teacher on the surgical unit to see if that's happening. I wonder if they're seeing the same work-life balance, that they're like, no, I've made an appointment. I'm post-call today. I don't know if that's happening in their world, because it's happening in our world. Like, they're making appointments during our office hours without post-call situations.
Oh yeah, you're teeing up the story about the eyebrows. Well, yeah, like, so the story is that this young lady did not show up for hospital rounds one day. You get kind of worried about them too, right? Like, because you kind of think that was at a time when our clerks were all coming from Halifax, so they were away from home. And so then you really worry about them, because you think of them in some apartment down, we call them the beehives, right? Like down on Millage Avenue. And I'm like, should I call her? Like, where is she? And she rolls in at 10:30. And I said to her, well, hey man, are you okay? Like, where were you? And she said, oh, I couldn't get another appointment to get my eyebrows waxed, so I had to get my eyebrows waxed. I thought to myself, like, holy God, wouldn't you at least lie? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, say you had a doctor's appointment, say anything but that. But just to our point, right? That they like don't feel like they need to defend this. I mean, that's a bit much, right? Like, she didn't show up for work. So I had an issue with that from a professionalism standpoint. But it's this interest in having the other commitments in life taken care of. But then, what happens July 1st, or you finish your residency, and, like, if you or I had a sick patient, like, there's no such thing as the end of the day or the end of your shift. You finish taking care of your patient until you can either appropriately hand over or whatever. And like, a surgeon would have no time for that, I don't imagine, thinking about how, like, you don't just walk out of the OR, like you turn into a pumpkin or something.
Yeah.
So how can we then prepare our students? It was a harsh reality even for me. Like, I came from post-call era, right, as a resident, to being a staff at a center where that wasn't a thing. And so it took a good 6 months to be able to get up the resilience and ability to hang out all the day the next day.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, we don't have peri-MP or paro rules as staff.
Yeah.
And maybe this generation will create those rules, which protects us from ourselves, right? And so...
Yeah, but requires like an enormous health systems change for the ability to provide coverage and whatnot, let alone the rural areas, which is like a whole other thing. But if you and I always wanted to take post-call, are we now going to job share and make half the money?
Right.
To cover the same service? Like, it's just some considerations that I think that, are complex problems that smarter people than me could maybe offer a solution to, but post-call is always something that kind of comes out. And I think my opinion is, and call it kind of the crotchetiness of getting older, but is to at least allow some choice. Right now, our students aren't really given a choice. They're supposed to have post-call days. And if they don't take their post-call day or dare to stay to see something interesting, they're almost vilified by their peer group because they're setting a precedent that can't be attained, right? Mm-hmm. Or we reward them for like showing interest by having maybe a better assessment when maybe that makes other students look bad. I don't know. I just think that a hard and fast rule is not going to be the best thing for everybody.
Yeah. It's a tough topic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not changing as quickly as some of the other things that are changing, because we still have to cover patients 24 hours a day. That's not going to change.
Right. So when you look at the CanMed's roles and our responsibility as educators, knowing your stuff and knowing how to take a history and this sort of thing is one piece of the puzzle, but there's also this ability to like teach yourself, like be able to teach others and share information and do scholarly work around like research and whatnot. What do you think about the millennials and their approach and what we can offer them in terms of their ability to teach and present and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I think they just have high expectations of their teachers, right? And they know the technology. So I think our PowerPoint presentations are now old school and a snore for them, especially if there's all kinds of words in there. And so I know I need to step up my game, but I don't know where to look for it. I might ask a millennial that tomorrow.
Well, considering that our didactic lectures at the medical school are taped, right? Because they're on and they are given to them on Brightspace or the web or however they do it. And the students, if they want to watch them, they watch them on 1.5 or 2 times the speed.
That's right. Because they're amazing multitaskers, I guess.
Well, and we're too slow for them, I guess. Well, they want to cut through the shenanigans, right?
Yeah, so I think as a teacher, how can we accommodate them is the question, or how do we need to change our ways in order to be better teachers? I think so. I just don't know where to find that information, and I think it's part of it is asking them. But one thing that has come up is that they do like hands-on learning, right? And so simulation is where the medical school is going anyway, and has become an interest of mine, but it's scary. Like, even as the teacher at simulation, my adrenaline's going, and I know where the case is supposed to go. The kid is gonna die. Like, but the cost of it for our education programming and
like just the maintenance and the human resources to maintain it and to keep it running and it be smooth and
but that's how they want to learn. Right.
But is there any room for sort of kind of like some innovative or old school techniques? Like, I trialed for a while kind of the walk in the woods sort of teaching session, which like nobody ever wore appropriate shoes. So it was kind of a bust. So again, speaking to outlining your expectations clearly, because we, rely so much on technology, which I 100% agree is an enormous part of where we're going in medical education. But maybe every teaching session doesn't have to be pre-planned with technology. Maybe just kind of a walk or a stroll, or like the old school, coffee in the lounge. Is there a place for that?
Oh, curious. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Or
like,
I just don't know how it's guided, right? Like, is that going to meet one of the objectives at the medical school?
No, but maybe we're paranoid, right? Like, how many times have I drawn on a weird piece of scrap paper, like a big rock of stool and a rectum and encopresis, and I can see the picture that I draw in my mind because I have done it so many times on the back of magazines, on the back of whatever you can get your hands on when you're chatting with a student. And that's a lot of the teaching that actually stayed with me. The surgical resident who drew 3 lines and talked to me about isotonic and hypotonic fluids.
Right.
And that I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as teachers too, to make things like really perfect and really flashy. And then we lose all this time because we don't actually know how to navigate that well. So I really would make a plug for balance. But you're right. I think that middle ground, the dry, wordy, plain PowerPoint presentations should just like die a quick death.
Right. Because they're going to be on their phone doing other things while that presentation is happening.
You've just lost them. Like, short of being able to like do an interpretive dance at the same time, like there's not a sweet chance they're going to be paying attention. So speaking of kind of old school, have you ever heard yourself say, well, when I was in medical school, I think I just said it in my story, when I was in medical school, or like, well, when I was a resident or whatever?
Oh, I catch myself all the time. And I don't know if that's the right thing because I don't think they care.
Yeah. I could almost confirm that they don't. Because my kids don't care when I talk about, no, we really want to watch the movie The Goonies. It's fantastic. And they're like looking at me like, unless I see a YouTube trailer, you've lost me.
Exactly. No, I catch myself saying it and then I try to correct myself. But what I find harder is that, like, as the coordinator for the pediatric clerkship coordinator in Fredericton, I have to like rally up my colleagues to be teachers, right, to these learners. And I think what's harder is the next generation older than they want to tell those stories. And I can't teach them not to because now we're 2-3 generations away and it's even harder for them.
And I just cringe too, because these are like beautiful people who have so much to offer. They've trained us. And then I hear the words come out of their mouth and I'm thinking, oh man, they don't care. And that actually almost takes the integrity out of your teaching moment, because
times have changed.
Yeah, right. And like, to be a good teacher, I think we need to keep up with the times a bit and then figure out how to know our audience, right? Like know our learners, understand at least somewhat the generational difference.
But don't talk about it.
Right, but don't talk about it. But at the same time, we can't, it's like you and I, again, we're pediatricians. So what's the worst thing you can do in an encounter with a teenager, right, is try to be cool. Yes. Right? Like, oh, are you smoking the, like air quotes kind of, the weed, or whatever. Like you have to be your authentic self, but at the same time appreciate that your audience has an expectation, up our game a bit to really kind of get there and then troubleshoot, right? Like it's not going to be the same for every learner. It's not going to work for everybody. Your one style maybe. So being nimble, being flexible, doing faculty development sessions so you can kind of try a few new moves every now and then.
Right.
What's your best move? Do you have your best? What's your best? I don't know. We learned a lot from you today. Like I think that your assessment strategy is a gold mine.
Yeah. I don't know what my next move is. I guess I'm asking them more questions. So I feel like they are my teacher.
Them? That's a whole other podcast.
They are my teacher, right? Okay. So like, well, the case where you're like, oh, this is interesting. I know this is coming tomorrow and I could go and do my literature review myself, but go read up around type 3 fibro.
Yeah. It would be great if you could it would be great learning if you could bring an article or two that like summarizes the plan for these patients.
Yeah. So like academically, I'm getting them to do some of the literature review. And sometimes they're bringing in patient information that I wouldn't have even thought of going to, right? Like I go to the specific PEDS journal that might have it, but now they're finding alternate resources. So sometimes I get these tips from them that I would never have found myself, right? So
because we just don't have that same time for contemplation that I hope to teach my students, that we need to slow down.
Yeah.
Like there's the fast part of life and then there's the slow part of life.
Yeah.
And I really hope that knowing how fast their life is and then it gets faster and faster and faster, and as I get older, I want to go slower and slower and slower, that we can offer them that. But, one thing I've always admired about you is, even though, you're so much fun and we've been friends forever, so it's easy to know all the things about you, but you're a tough cookie.
What do you mean?
You're, like, I think that, you bring a really nice balance of nurturing and caring and responsive to the students. But, you're no BS, my friend.
Yeah.
Like, I shudder at the thought of somebody telling you that they were waxing their eyebrows. Like,
correct. I am not afraid of confrontation, and I will bring it up immediately, because otherwise I just brew on it. And then once I address it, it's if you brew on it, then you worry about the response. But I think if you address it in the moment and just deal with it, then...
Yeah. So again, another tip for like life and with learners is this sense of, okay, this thing happened and it was really unprofessional. And so I'm going to go tell the clerkship director that it was really unprofessional. And so then they can put it in their evaluation that's 3 weeks from now.
Yeah.
Is just insane.
No, just tell them straight up to their face.
Yeah. Don't be scared.
Yeah. And try not to let it affect your rapport with this learner, because you have to spend the rest of the week with them or whatnot. So that's the part that worries me, is that if I don't address it now, it's going to affect how I interpret their next step.
And so here's a thought. If we are scared of them and are like parking all these issues for the clerkship director to deal with, or we hide under, oh, well, you can't fail students anyways, or all this sort of stuff that we talk about, maybe we are the helicopter parents of their professional lives.
Dun, dun, dun.
Interesting. Something to leave the audience with today. So, well, Rachel, thank you a million for coming to our podcast today. And do you have any parting thoughts or parting words for us today?
No, I think that the final points basically are just times are changing and let's keep up, right? And in this situation, we need to know how the learners best learn And we might need to change how we approach that and take that challenge, and let's just learn it.
Yeah, and recognize that, yes, we have so much to offer to them, and we can learn so much from them as well.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thanks very much for today.
Thank you.